Hey everyone, this is going to be part 2, sorta not part 2, of our previous video. It's kind of a series I guess, but slightly different topic. This time we'll take a look at phylogenetic trees and why it debunks evolution as we know it. I know, pretty scary stuff. It's not every day you come across a video that shatters all our knowledge on evolutionary biology and subsequently on every foundation of biology that we know of really. Hey, the Darwin minute, you're a creationist.
Darwin's tree of life is most likely not a description of how life on Earth emerged and diversified.
Why is it Darwin's tree of life? He didn't build the tree nearly as extensively as the scientists that came afterwards. I don't really understand why Darwin gets credited for everything, even though the vast majority of our evolutionary understanding comes from research after his time. And of course, we have many different types of trees as well, some more specific, some with broader themes, and some with time estimates. But regardless of the type, we don't use this tree of life as evidence for evolution, but rather our evidence from various sources such as homology, fossils, and DNA form this tree of life. It's a conclusion that we've drawn.
I know that's a shocker, and yet some scientists go as far as to say that the tree of life has actually been annihilated by an onslaught of negative evidence.
Please point me to the reputable scientist who made this claim, because whenever creationists say something like this, it always ends up being someone who has a history of being criticized by the vast majority of other scientists, or is someone who doesn't even work in the field of evolutionary biology. He does go on to name a specific person later, so I'll make my main point when we get there.
In the previous 3 videos, we showed how paleontology poses an insurmountable challenge to the theory of evolution. Darwin himself predicted that countless intermediate animal forms must exist within the fossil record, given that organisms gradually evolved from one species into the next. However, what the fossil record actually shows is the exact opposite, namely that whenever new species appear, they do so suddenly and without evidence of precursory forms in the geological record.
Okay, so we talked about this already in our last video, but I do want to take a small bit of time to reiterate this point. When we see events like the Cambrian explosion, that doesn't mean these animals appeared out of nowhere. We have proper explanations on potentially why the explosion happened, such as, for example, a rapid increase in oxygen levels and the formation of the ozone layer. Rapid evolution means that it can be more difficult to find some of these intermediate fossil specimens, but it doesn't mean the animals came from seemingly nowhere. And now that we're on this point, even if we give you the argument that species can come out of nowhere without gradual change, that's not reflected anywhere in today's observations. For example, we should be able to see the sudden appearance of certain animals, but that is never observed. It's not like the idea of evolution where we observe small changes in populations over time, which has been documented over and over again, but is more difficult to observe for larger changes in short periods of time. If species appeared suddenly, that can be easily seen. So where was that been recently? Anyway, this diverges a little bit from the topic, so let's get back to the video.
Given that no attempt to reconcile paleontology with evolutionary theory has succeeded, Darwinian evolutionists have come to admit that the fossil record doesn't fit with their theory, as we will see at the end of this video.
He's always trying to claim, or at least give the impression, that scientists in general agree with his statements, that the fossil record does not concur with evolutionary processes and that the tree of evolution should be discarded as outdated or junk science. But that's not the case. For layman viewers, it's easy to believe him because they don't interact with scientists all the time. They don't delve into the discoveries of science and they don't get involved in the scientific community. But I guarantee you that scientists are not thinking what this person is claiming they're thinking. It's an overwhelmingly unanimous thought that evolution is true and accurate, the fossil record does not contradict Darwin's theory of evolution, and that the trees we build accurately represent the evolution of life over time.
For the same reason, they've started to turn their focus towards another field of study in their search for support of evolution: homology and phylogenetic trees.
Okay, so he's going to go into a bit of detail as to how these trees are potentially built and why homology is important. We're going to skip this because it's just to give a background on these topics, and he's not really making any extraordinary claims here. Let's move on to the juicy bit.
Ever since gene sequences began to be used to construct the tree of life, evolutionary biologists have run a wide range of studies in both genetic and anatomical homologies, comparing various genes, proteins, RNA molecules, and anatomical features between different animals.
Yes, there are many things to take into consideration when building a tree like this. Personally, I would say the most convincing factor would be the DNA evidence. Of course, things like homological structures and proteins are important too, but those are more so phenotypes and are conserved through evolutionary processes, so DNA is the best. Our trees right now are drawn largely from DNA evidence, and this has become such a common practice that there are many easy to use tools out there that not only do DNA alignments, but also allow you to draw rough trees of life. And of course, each tool is going to differ by the algorithm that is used, but you get the idea.
However, the results of these studies have not converged. In other words, we don't get one big coherent picture, but several pictures which mutually contradict each other.
Now, like I said before, yes, we get many different trees, and that will always depend on what kind of algorithms you use, what kind of features you are weighing above others, etc. But that doesn't mean they contradict each other. Differences will always be in minute details rather than overall pictures. For example, we as human beings will always be more related to chimps than tigers. That is never going to change no matter what model we use. But we can have some very, very small discrepancies, such as at what particular time a certain subspecies diverged, because again, that type of specific detail will depend on a couple of factors. But just because we have these differences does not mean they contradict each other. Contradiction would be something like disagreeing on if whales or sharks are more closely related to dogs, for example, which never happens.
For example, biologist Michael Sivanen compared no less than 2,000 genes in 6 animals from various phyla. Clearly, given the breadth and depth of his project, one would have expected that this one study would have also yielded one account of evolutionary history, one tree of life. However, here is what the New Scientist reported. In theory, he, Sivanen, should have been able to use the gene sequences to construct an evolutionary tree showing the relationships between the 6 animals. He failed. The problem was that different genes told contradictory evolutionary stories.
I don't know this biologist, nor do I know his study, which is why I decided to look up where this quote originally came from. It led me to a creationist website, surprise surprise, which then ultimately led me to the New Scientist webpage where the article with the quote was locked behind a paywall, so I couldn't get to any of the original papers or primary sources written by the author himself. Since I can't do that, I am very inclined to not trust anything presented here, since the quote is more than likely from a secondary creationist author. Also, regarding the claim itself, I do find it particularly hard to believe that a simple tree of life could not be formed with the 6 species that were being observed. But then again, I'll have to see what exact genes were studied and where the problem lies. My guess is that there was one or a few problematic genes that perhaps made it difficult to produce a cohesive story, but that doesn't mean the tree of life itself has been debunked entirely.
Not only did Sivanen himself have no problem admitting his failure, but he also moved on to challenge the Darwinian paradigm itself by saying that we've just annihilated the tree of life. It's not a tree anymore, it's a different topology entirely. What would Darwin have made of that?
What is this? If you really produce good evidence to discard the tree of life and subsequently any evolutionary thought that involves gradual change, then this would be seen replicated many times in other scientific studies. Not only that, but how would any person reasonably look at only 6 species and go on to conclude that the entire tree of life should be discarded? Again, I don't know if this is quote mining or if this scientist actually said this word for word, but if it's the latter, then I can see him somewhat making a claim that actually contributes to science rather than support the creationist claim that God made everything. See, he says that it wouldn't be a tree anymore, but rather a different topology, which I can see. Sometimes a tree isn't the best at representing evolutionary history because we have other factors that cannot be easily captured by a tree. One example is horizontal gene transfer, where certain animals, and especially prokaryotes, can transfer genetic information between species. So perhaps for certain parts of life, it may be more accurate to use a web of life or something along those lines. But even then, we would have weaknesses in the model because there's just so much you cannot represent in a flat diagram. Anyway, if Sivanen is implying something like that, then I can agree to some degree, but there would have to be more discussions revolving around that before we can really create something concrete.
Now, Sivanen's study is not the exception. The New Scientist pointed out that many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. The evolution of animals and plants isn't exactly tree-like.
Okay, but if they're saying that, that doesn't mean they're supporting a creationist worldview either. They would essentially be saying that the tree should be replaced by a better model, but this model would still follow the core principles of evolutionary theory. They're not saying the whole thing should be scrapped or that the entire idea of gradual evolution is false. Absolutely not, but more so that the tree perhaps doesn't represent reality as well as it could, and I can agree with that to some degree, only if you're expecting it to do more than it already does. Just because a few scientists came out saying the tree could be improved does not mean that anyone agrees that species randomly come out of thin air and doesn't follow any evolutionary patterns.
Trends in ecology and evolution has pointed out that evolutionary trees from different genes often have conflicting branching patterns, and the Biological Reviews has acknowledged that phylogenetic conflict is common and frequently the norm rather than the exception.
You're always going to have conflict when you look at certain genes, because genes are preserved in many different ways and they evolve in many different ways. And again, I always say this, but specific examples would be appreciated here instead of just general claims. I mean, I know I make general claims as well, but I'm not the one challenging a widely accepted scientific theory right now. All in all, what I will say is that just because there is a single scientist scientist or a small group of scientists that disagree with current tree models does not mean it is the norm. We are in an era right now where scientific thought is determined by the scientific community as a whole and not on individual scientists, because that is what the spirit of science is. It's about agreement and consensus, not about individual thought. Plus, you're going to have some extreme views everywhere, and science is no exception. It's easy to cherry pick out certain scientific thoughts that agree with your narrative while ignoring the grand overall thought. That's why consensus is so important and why we need to look at things like meta-analyses. Of course, if I was willing to bypass the paywall, I would be able to dive deeper into the origin of this finding, but unfortunately we won't be able to do that this time. Alright, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Fireshard, Alan Morton, Miss Fixit, and Edward Martin. I'll see you in the next one.